Tibet and Nepal, nestled in the heart of the Himalayas, share more than just a border. They share centuries of cultural, spiritual, and economic ties. Once both powerful Himalayan regions with thriving traditions and sovereign identities, their paths have diverged in modern times. While Nepal remains an independent nation-state, navigating complex relationships with its larger neighbors, India and China, Tibet has become an occupied region under Chinese control since the mid-20th century. Despite these changes, the historical bonds between Tibet and Nepal endure in many forms, from shared religious practices to ongoing people-to-people connections. Today we will talk about Tibet, Nepal and China with two guests from Nepal. Amish Raj Mulmi, who is an author. Amish is known for his book, All Roads Lead North, Nepal's Turn to China, and Vijay Kant Karna, a former ambassador to Denmark and the chairperson of the Center for Social Innovation and Foreign Policy. Welcome to the program, Professor Karna and Amish.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Right. So, Amish, in one of your articles published titled "The Silk Road Traders Who Traveled from Kathmandu to Lhasa," you wrote that trade was the backbone for cultural exchange between Tibet and Nepal. So, can you elaborate on the historical relations that Tibet and Nepal share?
I think so trade, why I say that trade was the foundational relationship between Nepal and Tibet. Actually, it's not just Nepal and Tibet, it's actually Tibet and the entire, let's say, the Indian subcontinent. I think the foundation lay in the salt for grains barter trade. And from there on, it started expanding onwards towards other more intricate forms of trade. So the Nevar traders of Kathmandu, they had the most capital, and they were stationed in Lhasa for almost years at a stretch. They had almost, I believe there were almost 30 to 40 merchant establishments, Nevar merchant establishments in Lhasa before 1950. And they were constantly having these sort of exchanges around trade. But if the Nevars were the capital rich ones, there were other traders all along the Himalaya. So Nepal and Tibet is of course there, but all along, like, I mean, in Ladakh, of course, but also in western Himalaya towards Garhwal and Uttarakhand, and in Nepal towards Mustang, where Mustang was one of the key nodes for the salt trade, and towards east. And once the British got access to Tibet and developed Kalimpong as a trading station, the Nevars of Kathmandu moved their bases to Kalimpong, and through Sikkim and Nathula, the access to Tibet was much easier. So that was the foundation of this intricate relationship of people-to-people ties, of, let's say, familial ties that happened during this period.
Right. So, Professor Karna, could you tell us about your findings in the role of Beijing in shaping Nepal's relation with its neighboring countries? Could you shed some light on the current Nepal-China relation?
For last few decades, the China's engagement in Nepal has been tremendously increased in different areas, in political parties, civil society, media, government, and other aspects, the economic relation, trade, and everything. So political party, especially on the communist parties, and those who are always in the power since last 2 decades, the communist parties in Nepal, they are powerful, and several people as a prime minister, still the communist party led government in Nepal. So last 5-6 years, it's a government mostly led by the communist parties. So that has given a special attachment, a special relation with the communist parties, and that is impacted on our relations with the other countries also, because they are trying to reduce the influence of India and US, especially the India. India, which has a long tradition of culture, language, religion, people-to-people ties, family, and everything. And different. Recently, today even, the Prime Minister KP Oli participated in a parade, which is 80th years of aggression against Japan. They have organized, and this is first time that the Nepalese PM participated in such a conference, and that has impacted on the relations with our relation with Japan. And one of the case, the important case that during the MCC, one of the US flagship infrastructure project, which was supposed to ratified by the Nepalese Parliament 3 years back, At the time, Chinese openly opposed the America's infrastructure MCC in Nepal. So that was the, I mean, that the classical case, that the how Chinese are trying to influence Nepal's decision making and foreign policy. So on this way, the main instrument for their influencing Nepal's political landscape is the Communist Party of Nepal. And in that way, they are investing a huge in the media, in NGOs. There are a lot of Chinese NGOs working in the Tarai region of Nepal, which is a very closely, and the Chinese are trying to build some infrastructure project in Tarai region. Under BRI, there is two projects selected from the Prime Minister constituency, Oli constituency, and one is a industrial park, another is a sports complex, and the border is around 10-15 kilometer of the India border. So they are trying to influence and replacing or minimizing the impact of or influence and engagement of India as well as the Western countries.
Right. So, Professor, you've said China's involvement in Nepal's, be it politics or social, economic, or infrastructure, is evolving. But is it evolving for the better for the Nepalese government and more so for the citizens of Nepal?
Look, in infrastructure, they have been almost all all road project, drinking water project, telecommunication. Many of the telecommunication projects are actually because of their lowest bidding practices, and they have acquired all the projects almost. But these projects are not being completed on time, and they are trying to earn the money by one excuse to another excuse, and the project for 3 years completed in 9 years, 10 years, and many of the projects became very delayed. So it's not in the Nepal's own interest. We couldn't find, and the Chinese has been using their own companies and became a market for them, and they are using their companies for the experience and other things in Nepal, and they are not completing any projects on time. Many of the projects, no projects completed in last 10 years on time it is. So it is delayed through one excuse to another excuse, and due to that one it is impacted on the Nepal's development process. So I don't find that such engagement is actually to in the benefit of Nepal. Oh yes, China. I mean for me, our neighbor is Tibet actually. China came in only 1955. Before 1955, we know Tibet is our border. So once China occupied the Tibet, now we have to deal with the Chinese. So, but the things are that China is our neighboring country. We have a huge trade with them, and it is again trade is imbalance. We import almost 200 billion Nepalese rupees, and we export only 2 billion Nepali rupees to China. And even on the trade, there are a lot of issues are related. So, and in that way, Nepal is not in a beneficial position. For a neighboring countries, we need to develop a very better and good relations with China. I cannot say that that we don't have. We must have relation with China, and China is our neighboring countries, and we have a huge, large border, almost 1200 kilometer, almost open border with the China. So in that case, our relation with India or China is very good, must be good, and one cannot influence the other internal affairs.
So, talking about Tibet's occupation by the Chinese military forces, Amish, how has the occupation of Tibet affected Nepal as a country in all aspects, be it culture or social or politics?
Here, I would like to give a bit of a historical context before answering this, right? For the most part, the Nepali people who live south of the Himalaya, let's say in the mid hills, they do not have much contact with Tibet, right? Except for the Nevaz traders of Kathmandu. Now, because of, let's say, post 1950, right? Post 1950, one of the first things that we saw historically was that trans-Himalayan trade started declining because, of course, there were tensions in Tibet, there was a border dispute with India, the Himalayas started getting securitized and militarized, so trade obviously got affected, right? So that was the first impact. Trans-Himalayan trade after 1959, particularly after the, let's say, the Tibetan protests in Lhasa and the escape of the Dalai Lama, the Tibet trans-Himalayan trade pretty much collapsed. In fact, we have records of traders pretty much by early 1960s saying there is no hope for trans-Himalayan trade anymore, right? So that's the first direct impact. But beyond that, for the ordinary Nepali, let's say living along the border, or let's say in the mid-hills, there was very little contact with Tibet. So they did not have that sort of an impact as such. However, for people living along the Himalayan border, let's say people of Tibetan ethnic groups, right, who had, let's say, like familial links, who had root gurus, root lamas in Tibet, who had, let's say, monasteries, who were, let's say, enclaves like Mustang, who were also paying tributes to, let's say, monasteries in Tibet, enclaves like Limi, who were paying taxes in Nepal, but also paying taxes or tribute to monasteries in Tibet. They were the worst of, they got the worst of the lot. In that, because the border got militarized, one of the primary occupations was trade. They could not trade anymore because they could not go across to Tibet. Their animals would graze in Tibet, whereas Tibetans would bring down their animals down south of the Himalaya to graze in the summers. They could not do that anymore. So transhumans, or let's say raising of animals, that started declining, right? They had families in Tibet. They could not visit them anymore. They could not marry them anymore, they could not have marital relationships in Tibet anymore. So that continued. In fact, I argue that the economic orientation of the people living in the Himalaya was not once upon a time. They were looking towards Tibet, whereas Tibet used to look south, right, towards because its orientation was like that. Like I said, Tibet used to import food grains in exchange for salt. That economic orientation had to change after 1959-60. Once trans-Himalayan trade came to an end, their economic orientation had to completely turn around and they had to look south. And they had to also find new avenues of economic, let's say, opportunities. So for instance, some communities managed it. For instance, in Khumbu, the Sherpas turned towards mountaineering. In Mustang, the Thakalis and the Lobas, they turned towards tourism. But let's say in Humla, right, or let's say towards Walung or even other places, there were serious food deficiencies, food insufficiencies, because trans-Himalayan trade was a way to make economic surplus, to earn economic surplus. That did not happen for a very, very long time. Now, this changed only when China started building more infrastructure in Tibet. Once China started building more infrastructure in Tibet, what Himalayan communities realized was that they could now look north again. So the first roads in these Himalayan borderlands in Nepal did not connect to Nepal. They connected to Tibet, because they wanted to take advantage of their traditional connectivity that they had with Tibet. They wanted to trade with Tibet once more. They wanted to trade across the border. And that is why the first roads connected to Tibet. It was easier terrain as well. And that has now developed into a point where 14 border points, the traditional 14 border points, they're all open for trade, but they're all open for passenger. They're not open for container traffic. They're open for, the only 2 border points are open for container traffic. The rest of them are open for personal trade. So now the improvement, now what has happened post 2002 as well, China and Nepal signed an agreement, something called a border citizens pass, wherein border citizens from each other's countries, like people living in the districts bordering along the border, they could travel up to 30 kilometers inside each other's countries for, let's say, without a visa. And Nepalis living along the borderland have started utilizing this border citizens card. They've been going to China, to Taklakot, to Kerung, to across from Walung for investment, for, let's say, trade, for economic opportunities, for businesses. So that momentum has begun again. However, it is also not as free as it was before 1950. Because earlier we have records of traders from Mustang going up all the way, to, like, say, beyond to Tradum Monastery, right? We have records of basically traders from Humla going up all the way to the Salt Lakes up further north. We cannot do that anymore. Traders along these borderlands cannot do that anymore. So in that way, this is how, let's say, post 1950, this is how the situation along Nepal's borderlands have changed. with China's investments in infrastructure and transport and connectivity, of course, things are changing now. And Nepal is hoping to take advantage of these connectivities by thinking of north-south corridors, economic corridors, So it's planned. So in fact, it's developing border roads with China. It's as part of the BRI as well. It's developing ports along the border. So these container depots. So Nepal is now hoping to take advantage of the infrastructure boom in China, in Tibet, and act as a conduit or a let's say transit state between India and China's trade. So it's hoping to take advantage of being sandwiched between these two giant countries.
Right. So Professor Karna, do you have anything to add on this question?
Actually, the things that the border relations with China, I mean the Tibet, has been almost stopped. And but you know one thing, that the people living in both sides are economically, socially, and culturally, religiously dependent on each other. So you are cutting the hands. They're so close. From 2015, they stopped almost the people's movement. The peoples go in the other side, they meet the families with the security cameras and security officials, and you have to return back in a day. Earlier, the livelihood, the people going to work in the Tibetan side, and they used to come to this side. So that has been completely stopped, and very few people are allowed. Like he was talking about Taklakot, Humla, there are a lot of people who has shops in Taklakot. They have a restaurant, they have a business, but now it is very difficult for them. The problem is that our government is not able to create such infrastructure to link these Himalayan people to the mainland of Nepal. So their life is became very miserable, because they have been dependent on the both sides. But now in Tibet, and one of the very classical case, that during the earthquake in 2015 in Nepal and Tibet, large amount of houses has been demolished and people died in Tibet, and Nepal has lost more than 10,000 people. So in that case, there was a town near the border called Tatopani, and that town is no more there. All the people were taken from that 200 kilometer inside Tibet. The village has been dismantled by the Chinese security forces. So whole border is securitized, and it's a big challenge for the Nepalese security also. So this has been a very bad impact, and however we are expecting Chinese government to reduce this security apparatus, securitization, and create normal border relations. Borderland it's a political boundary only. The people of both are the same. So that is why it affected the life, livelihood of the common people of both the countries, and they are still very poor, both in Tibet as well as in Nepal.
So just adding to what he was saying, during COVID, one of the things that we saw is that, like as I was saying, right, the economic dependence of the people living along the borderlands is still on Tibet or on China quite a bit, right? And we saw that particularly during COVID, when China closed down its borders unilaterally. China has unilateral control over the Nepal-China border, and China closed it down unilaterally because of its zero COVID policy for almost 2.5 to 3 years, right? And in several places along the Nepal-Tibet border, what we had were cases of food insufficiency. So China has, what it has started doing since 2008-2009 is that China has started supplying aid to these districts along the border, to communities along the border as food supplements, right? So you have flour, you have rice, you have others, let's say like, I mean, sometimes you also count clothes also, but also construction equipment, cement. So China stopped all of this. These food aid could not be delivered to these communities, and these communities started suffering. So what we have here is a dual sort of a situation where the Nepali state still does not have adequate infrastructure or state capacity to meet the needs of the people living along the borderland. And on this other side, China understands the role its, let's say, towns, its economic, let's say, outlook plays in the lives of the Himalayan borderland people and the control it has over the border. So what you have is a situation where these people, the people of the borderland, they need to take opportunities, like their opportunities remain not simply because of the accessibility, because of the, let's say, the limited state capacity that or infrastructure capacity that Nepal has on the south. But they are also dependent on China for aid, for construction of equipment, for keeping the border open so that they can go across and work,
So Amish, in your book, All Roads Are Lead North, you've mentioned, you trace Nepal and Tibet's tie all the way back to 7th century, right? So you also traveled to the border regions, like you mentioned, Humla and Limi, and spoke to the locals there. So when you were doing that, did you come across any interesting revelations?
Oh, actually, quite a few. But where do I start? Okay, let me, since you mentioned Humla, let me just talk about Humla, right? So one of the things that I find fascinating about Humla, Limi in particular, was that the people of Limi, it's a very small settlement of 3 villages, right? I think at the last census there were 900 people in total, and now much fewer people. The people of Limi, the young men of Limi particularly, were always on the move. And why? Because the furus, the wooden bowls of Limi, were supposed to be famous all the way to Lhasa. So the young men of Limi, what they do is they come to India, they source the bowls, the maple bowls from India. They go to, they first do a little bit of processing here. Then they go to Kathmandu, where they intricately, do carvings around it, place silver bands around it. Then they have shops in Taklakot where they go and sell it, right? So it's traveling all the way across Tibet, right? So that's the cycle for the entire year. So every almost 3 to 4 months, they're constantly traveling, they're constantly doing this. And Limi is a very interesting case in that it was an enclave, it was a Himalayan enclave that paid taxes both to the Nepali state as well as to Tibet, to the monasteries in Tibet. And in 1950s, right, before the border was demarcated between Nepal and China, Chinese authorities actually approached Limiwas asking them to join China, and Limiwas consulted the oracle, and the oracle said, no, go with Nepal. And that is how they ended up in Nepal. So that was a sort of, it was an oracular sort of the oracle told them to come to Nepal, right? So these sort of stories you'll find all along. You'll find stories like, for instance, in Mustang recently I found so there's a very old monastery called Logekar, which is supposed to be as old as Samye, or even older actually. Mustangis claim it's older than Samye. And in Logekar, there's a new prayer wheel, big prayer wheel, that has been installed by an association called Lo Assam Dibrugarh Sweater Trade Association. So here you have people from Mustang, Lobas, every winter they are buying sweaters in India, going all the way to Assam, to Dibrugarh to sell them, and that's the winter trade. So you can see those old patterns of trans-Himalayan trade still exist in some form or the other. They may not be the same, you're crossing over into Tibet with ease, with your animals, all of that, but you have those old patterns of living, or you have those old styles of, let's say, those connections, right? They're still alive in some way or the other. And I think that is, at least to me, during my travels, that was one of the most fascinating aspects of how people in the Himalaya, one assumes that, we've been constantly told that Himalaya is a remote place, like, it's a barrier. People are not in contact with each other. But you find that people in the Himalaya are constantly evolving, they're adapting to the times. They are developing new means of, let's say, sustenance, and they're innovative in ways that the state cannot even imagine. And they're, in fact, despite the state not having any capacity or any infrastructure or providing any facilities to them, they're succeeding in certain manners. They're succeeding in certain enterprises. I think that is the resilience, that adaptiveness is still very, very Himalayan in its nature.
So Amish, so when during your time speaking to the locals there, did you come across distinct identity of Tibet, and also Tibetans historically and culturally, and more importantly, geographically?
I think it's more about see, the Tibetan identity. Of course, I'm not going to get into the larger idea what the Tibetan identity is, because I don't think I'm the right person to do that. But I think anyone who travels in the Himalaya across, right, that connection to Tibet, historical Tibet, the larger Tibet, it's always there. It will never leave you, right? It is because it's there, like I just said, it's there through taxes, it's there through trade, it's there through marriages, it's there through root gurus, it's there through, lamas and monasteries, right? And pilgrimages. And I think that is, you will never miss that, So in fact, you will, even now, you will find the notion of pilgrimage has, of course, because the border has shut off, it is closed off, it's become securitized to a lot of people, you cannot cross the border with ease. So you cannot do the pilgrimages anymore. But even now, the number of people who want to do Kora, right, of the Kailash, I mean, it is incredible. I just met someone, a 70-year-old who had just returned from Kailash, and she was ecstatic, right? And you have these people all the time. Like, in fact, as I think this season alone, there were about 10,000 Indians who went to Kailash via Nepal. So you have these age-old traditional relationships beyond the Himalayas even existing now, right? What it requires is more, let's say, integration. We have to be, there has to be more ways of reviving these old connections that we have with across the Himalaya. I think that is more important to us now.
Right. So, Professor Karna, coming back to Nepal and China, amongst many other things like border tensions and Tibetans in exile, could you shed some light on the economic involvement of China and Nepal, and of course the impact that has on Nepalese people and Tibetans living in Nepal?
So, in one of our media reported that it's almost 1.3 trillion Nepali rupees China has promised during this last 10 years, but it is not being implemented any projects. So that has been, and then the trade imbalance, we have a very huge trade gap. I told you about that, the 200 billion we import and 2 billion we export. And other things, as Amish said you, that told you that the local trading has been almost stopped. The traditional trading has been almost stopped. Local production of this part of Nepal, which is many things, I mean that the medicine, herbal medicine, and then there are local productions of that area, Himalayas. So it is not being exported. Even some of the traders based in Kathmandu, they used to export the Tibet, like flour, many things they export, but nowadays not allowed in Tibet. So it has been affecting the economic relationship, but our relations with the economically, with the trade, they are in very imbalance. Our business relations has been tremendously increased because we have been importing a huge amount through third country like the India from Calcutta port, and we have a two trading point, almost one, almost another one is almost closed because of this flood recently few months back, which is, so another issue in this regard is that the climate change, which has been bloody, and China in Tibet, a large amount of infrastructure being made in creating in Tibet, and then another issue with that one, that the China is creating a few township in the border, and which is expecting, I don't know much, but expecting that that new township will not be your neighbor, will be the Tibetans. Your neighbor may be the Han Chinese population of the mainland. It's something I call it like a Gaza and West Bank. So it's another issue that in few years you find nobody is familiar to your, I mean your family or anyone. So many of the township in the Nepal-China border in Tibet areas, and another issue is that the many hydroelectric project, including this Brahmaputra, which is a bad impact on Nepal's eastern Himalaya, and yet not know, any data are not uh, produced in the international media or anywhere. Even so there are huge amount of infrastructure being carried in the rivers basin. So, water flow and other issues and that impact on the Himalayas which has been melting very fast. And another issue between China and Nepal is that our many glacier lakes are under threat. So, and this time we have a flood because of the glacier. So, it's a kind of a that the economic environmental challenges are growing due to man-made creating things that in Nepalese part there are very few infrastructure, there is not much infrastructure and even not adequate actually. So, but that part is very important.
Professor, so you've to a great extent discussed China's infrastructural involvement in Nepal. Could you tell me how is that different, those engagements different from other countries' engagements with Nepal?
Actually, in the early there was Indian, Japanese, South Korean, even Italian and other companies were involved in Nepal infrastructure project. But last few years, what we found that almost all project goes to the Chinese company, and that is managed different way of doing the business that way. And one important point that in every tender, Chinese put the lowest bidding, and by that way they have acquired almost all major infrastructure projects. And that has actually sometimes our government official going China to search the company, where is that company. Even they left without informing the government, they left the areas, and then our delegation go and trying to reach out the company, requesting to come and complete the project. It has been done, and several road projects are something like that. Even some of the river diversion projects are not completed in time. There are two major river divert projects, irrigation projects, and so these are the major impact. There are several reasons behind it. He led the research. I think he will be answer better on that one. Yeah.
No, what we found in our research, like you said, was that one of the there's a couple of patterns that we found was that of course the Chinese companies bid low, right? I mean that is a globally known fact that Chinese companies bid lower, and we also what we found was that in several projects there were several Chinese companies competing with each other for the lowest, let's say, right. So they were outbidding, let's say, or outbidding because of the prices other Japanese or let's say Singapore companies who have all in fact at various stages also written to the Public Procurement Monitoring Office in Nepal regarding this, right. The other thing that we found was that as with a lot of these infrastructure projects require, let's say, large sums of money, right. In some instances, let's say where the Chinese are funding themselves, right, we find that the companies themselves, the companies that eventually get the contract, are also negotiating with Nepali partners, Nepali political leaders, and are also securing the funds from the Chinese, let's say, side. So what you have is a company pretty much, let's say, ensuring all the, let's say, I mean, a company ensuring that it has, let's say, the right networks inside Nepal, the right networks inside China to get the contract that it wants, right? So one is that. The third is that we also find, like we said, there is a certain amount of political influence. There's a certain degree of political influence in which the way these infrastructure contracts have been awarded. And that is now clear simply because a lot of these infrastructure projects, particularly from the Nepali side, are not being economically productive. So we have two international airports that are not running, and those in particular continue to come up in conversation every now and then. And because of that, Nepal is not in any position to take any more loans from the Chinese Exim Bank. And Nepal has clearly told China, in fact this is one of the last, like there was a major discussion during the BRI negotiations in December, that Nepal would rather prefer grant based projects than any other, let's say, loan based, or let's say it doesn't want any more loans from China. And which is why there was a lot of discussion around the semantics of how do you mention this in the BRI implementation agreement, right. So finally we've agreed to some sort of a compromise between both sides. But the current situation is that the non-viability or the non-operationalization of certain infrastructure projects like these airports has forced Nepal to sit back and sort of relook or reorient itself as to what its infrastructure requirements are and how does it go ahead, because Nepal needs infrastructure and it needs them because they are better for economic connectivity, right? Like, I mean, the MCC is going ahead, we are exporting more power to to India. One of the goals of the BRI is also to export power to China. So there is a requirement for more infrastructure. But how do we do that? Where do we get the funding from? How do we take this ahead? I think there is a big question mark over that right now.
Right. So thank you so much, Professor Karna and Amish, for today.
Thank you very
so
much.
much. Thank you so much.
That is all for this episode of In Conversation with Tibet TV. I will see you next time.